We have a special guest with us today, Sharyl Attkisson, 5-time Emmy Award-winning investigative journalist and author. She was formerly an investigative correspondent in the Washington Bureau for CBS News and a substitute anchor for the CBS Evening News. She currently hosts and manages the investigative news program Full Measure with Sharyl Attkisson on Sinclair Broadcasting Group, which focuses on accountability and investigative reporting. Attkisson has authored several books, including Stonewalled, The Smear, and her recent book, Follow the Science, How Big Pharma Misleads, Obscures, and Prevails. Welcome to the show, Sharyl Attkisson.
It's great to be here. Thank you, Jimmy.
Well, it's great to have you. Now, you came to my attention because on Twitter, I came across this video that you did. I think this was in 2006.
Yeah.
And let me just remind people the kind of bombshell report you did about the flu vaccine. And let's listen.
Here's what scientists have found. Over 20 years, the percentage of seniors getting flu shots increased sharply from 15% to 65%. It stands to reason that flu deaths among the elderly should have taken a dramatic dip, making an X graph like this. Instead, flu deaths among the elderly continue to climb. It was hard to believe, so researchers at the National Institutes of Health set out to do a study adjusting for all kinds of factors that could be masking the true benefits of the shots. But no matter how they crunched the numbers, they got the same disappointing result. Flu shots have not reduced deaths among the elderly. It's not what health officials hope to find. NIH wouldn't let us interview the study's lead author.
So we showed this before on the show. Everybody should go watch that video. It's amazing. You did, first of all, you did that 20 years ago. You look exactly the same. I don't know how you pulled that off.
I don't know about that.
Was that the help of Big Pharma? I don't know. We'll see. But your latest book, Follow the Sun. First of all, how did you? Well, was there any fallout from you doing that report? Because that was really, I haven't seen a report like that on national news or any kind of corporate news since. So how did that come about, and how were you allowed to do that?
Well, I was assigned to cover stories about vaccines in the pharmaceutical industry in the early 2000s. People may not remember, we were all doing it, not just CBS News, the New York Times, the Washington Post, LA Times, all the networks. These were big stories, and a lot was being uncovered. There were congressional hearings, but something changed. I'd say 2006 time period, we were starting to see that change in the relationship between big pharma and media companies and what they wanted from us, meaning the bosses at the corporate levels. So you saw that report on the flu shots before what I would call the clampdown on those kinds of stories, when they were still being invited and well received, at least by my bosses at CBS. So I was covering a lot of these issues, shocked at what I was learning, because I'm not a health reporter. I was assigned to sort of cover the return of the smallpox vaccine program after 9/11, which was halted after myocarditis and deaths from that vaccine. I started to learn so much and realized that I could do stories every week the rest of my life on these scandals. But so many of them were just unbelievable to me. And I spent years working on some of them before I ever published my first story, because it just sounds crazy at first until you start to understand how things work. And it's not how I ever thought they did. You know, I always relied on mainstream medicine and the government and our public health agencies, and was shocked as anybody to learn these things. And I thought that was very important to bring these types of stories to light on the news.
And so tell me about, so you didn't get any backlash from, so people were doing those kind of reports. In fact, I kind of remember Jon Stewart and brought on RFK Jr. in the early 2000s to talk about his research on vaccines, and he thanked him for his work. Joe Scarborough had RFK Jr. on, and he commiserated, said that his son was injured by a vaccine, and then all of a sudden it just all went away. So what happened?
Well, I learned only with the benefit of hindsight that at the time we were starting to feel pushback over these sorts of stories, the pharmaceutical industry was making new partnerships with media organizations, including CBS News at the corporate level. And together, pharma and these media corporations were lobbying as partners on Congress to loosen up the rules to allow more pharmaceutical advertising on TV and other media. People may not know if they're not old enough. This was forbidden against the law until what I think is relatively recent history, and it's forbidden in most other countries to advertise prescription drugs. But that meant billions and billions and over time, trillions of dollars for the media companies with this partnership. And as that partnership was being forged at the corporate level, we were starting to feel the effects of it in the news division at CBS. And I'm sure that happened at the other media outlets as well.
And so when you refer to it as a partnership, what do you mean by a partnership?
Well, I was told specifically that lobbyists from the corporation at CBS went together with pharmaceutical industry lobbyists on Capitol Hill to lobby members of Congress to make sure that there was more advertising allowed on the network. So literally a partnership to try to financially benefit both sides of the equation, but I would argue maybe at the expense of public health.
So that's quite a partnership. So it just sounds like corruption, right?
Listen, I have my own thoughts over time about whether those types of partnerships should be allowed ethically and how they could be firewalled, at least from the news divisions, but they are not. I expect that these pharmaceutical companies would want to increase their bottom line the best they can. I am not shocked, especially with what I know now, that they might hide or cover up the things that they've done that, about side effects from drugs and dangers and harms has been well documented because they have a fiduciary duty to their shareholders or whoever they're reporting to make money. But we in the media were supposed to be, at least I thought, sort of firewalled for that so we could at least provide some independent oversight, particularly when Congress also fails to do so because both parties, Republicans and Democrats, get so much of their money from the pharmaceutical industry now.
So what I often say is that, when a news agency gets money from an advertiser, in theory, it's to take that money that provides the money, the resources so they can do investigations. And what they're really doing is bribing the news companies. So they're funding their non-investigation, correct?
Yeah. It not only influences theoretically the advertising they get on the network, but we have seen that it largely influences the stories that don't get done. So it wasn't just that, and I certainly don't object to the pharmaceutical industry wanting their side of the story heard in a controversy, of course, in a story. But it came to be, and this is commonplace now, it just wasn't back then around the 2006 time period, where they didn't want stories to air at all. And some, managers who I think were conflicted at the networks and other media organizations also were starting to censor stories that had not been done on such a large scale before. So I knew something was wrong and something was different when they weren't just arguing, be sure to tell both sides of this argument. They were just saying, we can't tell this story at all. The people must not know about it.
And are you surprised that news media organizations and journalists ubiquitously just accepted this new paradigm?
Yes, and I will tell you that there were a lot of reporters who were like me, who were covering these issues, good reporters at other news outlets who had similar experiences as I did, but maybe just didn't have the wherewithal to ultimately launch successful challenges. Honestly, I gave up too, to some degree. Once they didn't want the pharmaceutical stories. Gosh, there are thousands of things for me to investigate. I tried to look at other things, that I could investigate and publish some online, because you can get things published online at CBS, for example, easier than what you could get on the broadcast network. So I tried to continue to pitch and do those stories as best I could, but look at other things. So we as reporters understood that to get on the air in a very competitive environment, you do the stories the bosses want. You don't do the stories they don't want that they're never going to then publish. So it just sort of becomes, the lay of the land after we understand what they do and don't want.
So you talk about your accidental enlightenment. Tell people about that.
I was, I think, like a lot of people, particularly probably how they were before COVID, where I thought health and medicine were really one of the last trusted institutions. I've been an investigative reporter for many years and maybe didn't put a lot of faith in government and the way things work at federal agencies and so on, because I'd seen so many instances of waste, fraud, abuse, and corruption. But I really didn't think about that applying to the health agencies because I kind of saw that as a pure thing, science, and it's pure and doctors having our best interests at heart. But after 9/11, I was assigned by CBS to cover the restart of the smallpox vaccine program. And that would be because maybe terrorists would now, the thought was, use smallpox as a biological weapon. So maybe we should start revaccinating everybody. And what I learned was, just basic things surprised me, that the reason we don't all get smallpox vaccine right now, even if that could be a threat of a bioweapon coming our way, that vaccine is more problematic than others in terms of acknowledged side effects. So to start the program up again as they were going to do and give it to so many civilians and first responders and military was a big deal. And a lot of experts were cautioning against it, public health experts, and were watching it very carefully. Long story short, after a fairly short period of time, not only did the first responders not want to take these shots, they were offered it first, but those in the military who were forced to take them, there started to be adverse events. There were some deaths, and I've learned that even a couple of deaths that may not sound like a lot signal or imply many more have occurred that may not be attributed to the cause. So it's important, even if there's just a handful of adverse events and deaths, because it implies many more the way the system works. And one of those deaths, Jimmy, I don't know if you remember David Bloom, an NBC reporter who had embedded with the military, died of a blood clot. And I knew he had had the smallpox vaccine, and I had read that blood clots and so on had been reported to be side effects from that vaccine and others that he got to embed with the military. And it was not properly reported as a potential vaccine death, which was required under the monitoring system. And I broke that news that, it looked to me like a cover-up that they didn't want, meaning either the military or civilian complex certainly didn't want to admit there was a potential vaccine link to the death of a news correspondent that had embedded with the military. As a result of my reporting, it was reported to the proper database, David Bloom's death, as a possible vaccine adverse event. They stopped the smallpox vaccine program ultimately because of the side effects and problems. And that was just sort of my introduction into learning all these things I never even thought to question about, vaccines and medical science and what the establishment might do.
So what's interesting about this particular vaccine to me is that during COVID, at the beginning when people were vaccine hesitant, I saw many memes on social media showing a person with smallpox and attributing it all to the vaccine. And then I also did a little research. The Midwestern doctor wrote a Substack on it, and it turns out that there was a lot of controversy over the smallpox vaccine, even 100 years ago, and that towns and large groups of people were protesting against the mandatory use of the smallpox vaccine. And so did you notice that too during COVID, that people were referring to smallpox, and that was like,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Smallpox, and another example that's a go-to is the polio vaccine. I will mention that my daughter's had all her vaccines. I didn't know about any of this, and I'm not saying I would make some different decisions. I wouldn't just probably across the board not vaccinate her, but she's had all her vaccinations. But one thing I discovered as they talk about the polio vaccine, most people don't know, all of the last cases of polio in this country were caused by the vaccine. They were vaccine strain polio. And I learned that from the head of vaccine court when I was covering, vaccine injury cases. And what makes me mad about that, Jimmy, is when my daughter got her shot for polio, she was offered, she didn't get the shot, she got the oral, which they called sugar water.
Yeah.
So we went to the doctor and they say, would you like to give her sugar water or a shot? And as a parent, you say sugar water, like, why is that a choice? They should have said to me, and all parents, I think, should have been told, the sugar water, as they call it, has a slight risk of giving your child polio. The injectable version had no risk of that, but they were giving and offering the sugar water version, the oral polio vaccine, to millions of kids without telling us and letting us make an informed choice. I was so angry about that. And I thought, this is just one of the thousands of things I learned about the whole program and how the government represents things and what's really going on.
So the oral polio vaccine, it uses a different type of concoction, put it that way. And yes, it can give, in fact, we don't give the oral polio vaccine to people in the United States anymore. But guess what? They still export it and they give it to people around the world, including Africa, correct?
Yes, shortly after my daughter had the oral polio vaccine, it was quietly pulled off the market. Now, why wouldn't that make international headlines? You know, if news were neutral, that you would want to know that they're pulling off the market the vaccine they've been offering and giving kids for years that was causing the only cases of polio left in this country, that they quietly pulled it off the market for that reason and, you know, switched strictly to the injectable version in the United States.
Now, did you notice during COVID, to get people to take the vaccine, they were touting the fact that polio had shown up again in wastewater in New York? What they didn't tout was that it was then determined that that polio they found in the wastewater came from the vaccine.
That's right. Good catch, Jimmy. You know, there's always a story behind the story, particularly when the government seems to be wanting to promote, unfortunately, a concern or maybe even provoke a scare. I've learned there's typically some kind of interest behind it if you follow the money. And yes, you're right. That was believed to have, if I remember correctly, believed to have come from someone who had either a foreigner or someone who had traveled in a foreign country, but had brought into the United States a vaccine strain case of polio that was spreading. But that was not made clear in most of the news coverage of it. It was just, oh, polio's an outbreak again. And there's always this implied blame on people who have not gotten vaccinated. And that's always used to get, you know, more people vaccinated, even when sometimes the vaccines may be part of the issue.
And so how bad is that? You have a chapter in your book called 10 More Eye Openers. Could you go through some of those eye openers for us?
Well, without the book in front of me, I haven't looked at that chapter in the last week or two. You can name some, or I can just tell you some other things that, along the way of my road to enlightenment, that come to mind.
Yeah, sure. Go right ahead.
Well, another thing that comes to mind is the fact that, you know, we think that the scientific journals are so pure, at least I did. And I know that my doctors are constantly referring to the medical journals as something, you know, the place to get information and the latest information. The journals are terribly conflicted and in many cases not to be believed. And I'm talking about the Journal of the American Medical Association, Lancet, all the famous journals that you know of. This is not according to Sharyl Attkisson. This is according to the journal editors themselves. And you don't see a lot about this, but Marcia Angel, Dr. Angel of Harvard, the former editor at the New England Journal of Medicine, she spoke against what was happening at her own journal and said she could not stop the pharmaceutical influence, which led to the publication of dishonest and misleading studies that imply medicines may be safe and effective when they're not. She was joined by Dr. Richard Horton of the British journal Lancet, the editor there, who said much of the science today is not to be believed. The way he put it was science had taken a turn toward the dark side. People don't understand that these scientific journals have, in essence, according to critics, been bought out. So that when you see something published, you know, that's touted in the press, there's usually a money interest that's promoting a study that may not actually be reflective of what's really happening with that medicine or that issue.
So I stumbled upon this also, and during COVID, I caught the editor of the British Medical Journal lying. And I found out that they get a lot of their money from the pharmaceutical industry, which is shocking to me. And so when you'll see a study and they'll say, oh, well, this drug, this early treatment for COVID or for anything doesn't work because we did a study and it's published in a peer-reviewed medical journal. What you're telling me is that those studies are rigged, correct?
I would say, and there's been instances of proof, but more often than we know, according to the journal editors themselves, yes, the studies are calculated by the drug company who's allowed to do this. I don't even get this dynamic. I don't understand why the drug companies and vaccine makers are relied upon to do their own studies and honestly provide the data on billions of dollars worth of drugs to the government as if they're honest. I did a story on my TV show a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, with a whistleblower from Merck talking about, as a virologist, they were literally crossing out and changing bad data about the MMR vaccine. And even when the FDA caught him, because he blew the whistle, caught the Merck doing this, the FDA continued to rely on Merck's own data and representations of the drug of the MMR vaccine in order to make other decisions. And I'm thinking, how do you rely on the vested interest, and especially when they've been caught making, they've had to pay billions of dollars in fines to settle cases for fraud and abuse and misleading. So you're relying on these same companies to tell you the truth about the medicines they want to sell. It just seems like such a crazy dynamic.
Well, it just seems like criminality to me. It seems like the opposite of, when they passed the law to allow pharmaceutical companies to give money to the regulatory agencies, actually fund the FDA, the CDC, in fact, to the point where the 70% of the FDA's, the drug safety part of the FDA is funded 70% by the pharmaceutical industry. And that just seems, again, criminal to me and crazy. And the reason they gave for that was they said that, they're going to be making so much money off these drugs, we should make them pay for the research. But that's not really the reason, right?
Well, let me say there may have been, what I heard, there may have been some good reason. There was a time when it was thought, or it was argued, that some drugs were taking too long to come to market because it is a very onerous process that's required. And the thought was, if the industry would kick into the costs of having the FDA review all their study information and make things happen faster, everybody could benefit. The problem is, as soon as that relationship started, and I would argue FDA has been somewhat conflicted already, the FDA began to see, as you kind of point out, the pharmaceutical industry as their customers and clients instead of us. And you can even look at their internal documents where they refer to the pharmaceutical industry, when it comes to matters of controversies, as the stakeholders and as the customers and as the clients. And in fact, if you and I as a journalist, you as a public citizen, were to try to get some information on an important public health issue that our government has collected information about on our behalf, supposedly using our taxpayer dollars, they will more often than not say that's proprietary, and they share that information with the pharmaceutical industry, but we can't have access to it as the people who are impacted. It's really a perverted dynamic.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong. Did I read in your book that pharmaceutical drugs are the leading cause of death? Am I misremembering that?
It depends on the analysis you look at, but it is consistently, no matter who does the analysis, a top cause of death. And we're talking about prescription drugs when used as prescribed, not even talking about being abused or there being mistakes. And that is because, so many people are taking prescription drugs and there are so many side effects. And that's only the ones we know to attribute to them. We know there are many side effects and long-term effects of medicine that are probably not captured. So again, every once in a while, you will see a story done on that fact because it's consistent year in and year out. But doesn't that seem like a really important fact and statistic that deserves a whole lot more coverage?
Yeah, of course. Yes, of course it does. Now, it sounds to me, now you're not a medical doctor, you're a journalist, correct?
Right.
It sounds like you've been doing your own research, Sharyl. That sounds very right-wing and extreme.
Well, at CBS, of course, because I work for CBS, for years I was considered or, criticized as left-wing. And then, of course, when I got into certain health things or certain political investigations that went in a different direction, suddenly I was accused of being right-wing. And today, it's kind of flipped because the people who used to care about these things were more liberal leaning. And I'm talking, seemed to me, in the 90s and early 2000s. And now it's totally flipped. And I would tell you something interesting. You look back at the smallpox vaccine startup that failed in the 2001-2002 time period that I told you I covered. When that failed and when some public health experts at the time spoke against the vaccine program because of the dangers and risks, nobody was called anti-vaccine. That was a newly invented propaganda campaign, probably one of the cleverest and most successful ones I can think of, that came about around 2004, 5, 6, as the vaccine industry saw that more and more investigations were being done on vaccines, as more brain damage and autism cases were working their way through the vaccine court, and they had to get ahead of this wave of news coverage that could be coming in congressional hearings, and they invented this anti-vaccine narrative that means you're not supposed to question one of the most important products given to nearly every child in America multiple times that undeniably carries risks and side effects. You're just not supposed to question it. And that's, largely where I think a lot of people stand today, oddly enough.
So when I was a kid and you were a kid and we got vaccinated, the total vaccine schedule cost around $10, right? And now how much does it cost?
It's in the thousands. I'm not sure you can calculate. I think it's probably in the tens of thousands. It's an invisible cost to us because it's covered by insurance. That's actually us. Or the government pays for the doses for people, or it's covered through Medicare and insurance for the poor. We're paying the cost, but it's pretty invisible because we're not directly paying the cost. But that's simply because the number of vaccines, I'm sure I had a couple, but I got the measles, I got mumps, I got those diseases in my era. We didn't have the vaccines. I got chicken pox. Now, there's multiple doses because the vaccines don't work very well. So they all have boosters. They have to be given multiple times. Even then, some of them are failing. But there's so many. It is just a blockbuster industry for, the pharmaceutical industry. And if they can get a vaccine, on the schedule, on the CDC recommended schedule, that's instant blockbuster for them. So that's the gold standard. That's really what they're all aiming for.
That's instant blockbuster profits for Big Pharma if they can get it on the schedule. That's what you mean.
Right.
Yeah. And so right now there's a lot of propaganda about measles. And there was a young girl who they said, it's been reported, died from measles. Well, it turns out she most likely died from a bacterial pneumonia infection, and they gave her the wrong treatment. Are you familiar with this case?
Vaguely. I have not personally looked into it, but I read some of it because I suspected as soon as they said there was a measles death, which would be very unusual in an otherwise healthy child, you have to, based on the government's records, suspect there's more to it. And it's much like people saw during COVID. If someone died and they happened to test positive for COVID or happened to have COVID at the time, but they were dying, to make a real life example, but sort of an extreme, they were dying of cancer, they were signing death certificates attributing it to COVID because they wanted people to be afraid of COVID and, pump up the vaccines. Likewise, this is always the case with these outbreaks of diseases. I don't wish measles on anybody, but I will tell you that, the outbreaks that happen when they try to tell you how many were vaccinated in the outbreak and how many were unvaccinated, they're always trying to push your idea toward it's the unvaccinated people to blame, and that means more people should get the shots. That's all a well-orchestrated propaganda campaign. So when I heard a child died, I suspected the child may have died either of something else or with something else, or that there was more to the story. So I'm not surprised that it's being reported, the things that you just said. I haven't independently verified that, but that would be that's pretty much how things go.
I'm the most flummoxed by the lack of people who consider themselves anti-establishment, especially in this news space that I'm in, and truth tellers, and like to reveal government secrets, have absolutely no interest in this, and they don't push back against the lies so we know that they lied about everything around COVID. They lied about masks. They lied about where the virus came from, lied about funding it. They lied about the infection fatality rate. They made it seem way scarier than it was. They lied about herd immunity. They lied about natural immunity, lied about lockdowns. They lied about social distancing. There wasn't a thing that they didn't lie about. And what I cannot get over is how few people actually give a care about that. People that I would think that'd be naturally right in their wheelhouse to speak out against Big Pharma, they won't. Like you said, the people consider themselves on the left or the liberals, they're the biggest narrative enforcers, and they're doing the dirty work of Big Pharma in keeping people silenced who want to question these things. People who consider themselves questioners, they won't. does that surprise you too, that there's almost no one? You're one of the few people out there that's actually in journalism that is actually even talking about this. Chris Cuomo was a big narrative enforcer during COVID, and then he got injured, and then they put him on ivermectin, and now he's willing to talk about that now. So it's like maybe you and him. Are you surprised at how few people care about this? This is the biggest story of my life was COVID.
I think so too. And all the stuff we're talking about that impacts our health beyond just the vaccines and COVID. These are the most impactful stories I think journalists could be doing right now. And in some cases, perhaps the most ignored. I like to say that, the chronic health disease epidemic, we all have seen that grow for the past 20 years. The scandal is that as we go to the doctors or listen to our public health experts, they either don't notice, which is a problem, what we see in front of our eyes with our chronic diseases, or they pretend not to notice. Either one is equally as bad because we're just out here trying to figure out what's going on while they're simply trying to, refer you to expensive treatments and medicines for it rather than figuring out the root cause. There are journalists who want to do this work, and there are very few places the way our journalism groups are organized where you could work somewhere where they would permit this. It's just so much advertising and also the controversialization of the topic. I believe that the controversialization by saying it's anti-vaccine, the targeted attacks on journalists and researchers who actually look into this stuff, the targets by the industry and by government officials who are, influenced by them, it makes it really hard to go down that road. So you have to have a way to get this information out. I have an independent show now with bosses that are okay with it, but not many people are in that circumstance. And it's very disappointing, Jimmy, that more journalists haven't been able to find a way to step out. But I think part of it is because this propaganda campaign by the industry, they purposely understood if they could divide this issue along political lines the way that they did, that every time someone kind of raises it, eyes roll and people just start brushing it off as a political dispute, which it's not. But if you can define it in those terms, it makes people less likely to want to, touch it in a meaningful way.
So here is one of, I just covered a story recently. They're finding out. So everybody, I'm in Hollywood. Everybody in Hollywood's on Ozempic, and they're finding out that Ozempic is causing blindness in people. And in fact, one of your 10 eye openers is Viagra and blindness. Can you tell us about that eye opener?
When I was working at CBS, a little story crossed the wires, happened to be on an April Fool's Day years ago, that talked about a small study that had linked Viagra and blindness. And I thought it was hugely important because this is when everybody was starting to take Viagra. And it was sort of laughed off in the newsroom. And I thought it was, probably a really big story. So I started reaching out. I found some other studies. I looked through the adverse event database, which exists, and saw a clear signal to me as a non-medical person of blindness cases with people taking Viagra, deafness too, by the way. And as I continued to look into it, before I reported what I learned, the FDA actually acknowledged to me that this was an issue and they were about to put a label, work to get a label put on the drug warning of blindness. Before that, if you'd have said that to your doctor, he'd have just said, that can't be the cause. It's not on the label. It's sort of this self-fulfilling prophecy. If the doctors think nothing that's on the label could be caused by the drug, they'll never add the stuff that's caused by the drug to the label. But a lesson with the Viagra and blindness was, to me, it is frequently people outside the specialty. The person who unearthed that, or one of the people, is not the urologist group that was prescribing men with Viagra who should have been watching out for these adverse events. This was a doctor, an eye doctor, who was seeing this pattern of unusual blindness called nigh-on in men. And he started asking them questions, which a good doctor should do. And he learned that many of the men had just been taking, very recently in the last couple of days, with this blindness, had been taking Viagra, and he embarked upon the study. So one lesson I learned is it's frequently doctors outside the specialty who are not influenced directly by the drug company who targets the doctors in the specialty. And it's often the journalists who are outside health reporting or health reporters that can unearth these truths because they kind of come at it from a different angle, not just buying into everything that's told to them by the public health agency. And their pharmaceutical interests.
So another one of your 10 eye openers would be ghostwriting.
That was a big one. Again, I shocked this is allowed ethically, but frequently articles and studies that are put into medical journals are actually signed by what sounds like an independent doctor, someone who works at an academic institution. People don't know, including the other doctors reading the studies or the articles, that doctor has in essence been paid for the use of his name by usually a middleman working for the pharmaceutical company. So basically he's being paid to promote a drug or a treatment or a malady that will be treated by a drug. But there's no disclosure when you're reading this glowing article about this upcoming treatment. There's no disclosure that the drug company actually wrote that article and then paid the doctor to sign it. And this is a practice that is not illegal and was largely done. I have examples in the book in the cases of drugs that were put on the market, like Vioxx, and then removed for safety reasons, but had been heavily promoted through ghost-written articles and other means that I think are unethical and shouldn't be allowed in the medical profession, but these are common tactics.
And so, I also say, again, COVID opened my eyes to all of this. Before, I just trusted the medical profession without question. And you can buy off a scientist and you can buy off a doctor pretty easily, right?
Yes, but I would say it's a little more complicated. Maybe the doctor and the scientist wouldn't want to be bought off, but the industry learned that in the early 2000s, the researchers were still publishing studies. Let's say they're being paid by a pharmaceutical industry company, and they work at an academic institution. They conduct a study, it turns out poorly for the drug, or there's a safety issue. Maybe the drug company doesn't like that, but the researchers used to publish regardless because all findings benefit science and have to be published and known. The drug industry discovered during this time period that to stop that, they started having these onerous contract agreements. So now they may hire a university, but in the contract, it's going to say, you can't publish this, without our say so, which leads us to another problem. Like for one study that may show, let's say, a marginal benefit to a new drug, you may not know that there were 8 studies done that showed either no benefit or potential harm, but the drug company never published those. And you have no way to know if there was something done behind the scenes before this one study came out that appears to be some kind of a benefit. There may be a lot of science that's contrary to that you'll never see because they have these, contracts. And that started around the time there was a researcher out in California at the university who tried to publish after a failed AIDS vaccine. And the company wanted him not to publish so badly that they ended up suing him for $7 million personally when he insisted that this information had to be published for the greater scientific knowledge. Ultimately, that case against him was dismissed, but that just shows you what a chilling effect it can have upon the researchers who want to do honest research and follow the science wherever it really goes.
And so you say a close cousin. In the book, you talk about a close cousin to ghostwriting or hired guns medical professionals. What do you mean by that?
In nearly every instance, as I started covering medical controversies, when the pharmaceutical industry would decline to do interviews about the controversy, but referred to me to a supposedly independent doctor, I started researching these supposedly independent doctors. Other media were interviewing them too, but without asking the question. And I learned in every case they were working for the drug company with an undisclosed relationship where they were either being paid as a consultant or an analyst, or they had been, speaking at conferences and were getting money. That's not a problem to use their opinion, but it has to be disclosed in the news story so that viewers can understand they're hearing a pharmaceutical industry defense of the drug. They're not hearing an independent defense. And that happens all the time. And I'm not sure why more reporters that I saw interviewing some of the same people weren't asking the question or disclosing these conflicts of interest.
I mean, this is mind-blowing.
Can I tell you that one of my most mind-blowing ones was there's something called the Merc Manual that's considered a med school reference book. And Merck likes to say, Merck, the pharmaceutical company, It's one of the most popular reference books in the world, and it's available online as a consumer version. And knowing that Merck and these other companies have paid, as I said, millions and millions of dollars over the years for alleged fraud and misrepresentation, I'm like, how is Merck allowed to write such a widely referenced book for med students? And what does that book really tell about, let's say, Merck's own controversy with the Gardasil HPV vaccine? So I looked there and I found that under the heading of what doctors are taught by Merck in med school about the HPV Gardasil vaccine is that there were no serious side effects reported with this medicine. I about fell over when I read that, because if you just look at the label that Merck puts in with the vaccine, it has everything from death to paralysis as potential side effects. But here, doctors are being taught there are none. And as I've been discussing this since the book was published, Merck took that sentence or paragraph out of the online version of the Merc Manual. But did they insert the truth? Did they put in there what the side effects are? No, they just knocked out that whole section about, that there are no side effects reported with the HPV vaccine. So if they're going to not tell the truth about their own medicines and then downplay controversies that could implicate their medicines, but this is what doctors are learning, and then I argue this is why when you go to your doctor, they typically follow, not all of them, but they typically follow certain paths that don't follow up on what adverse events might be caused by the medicine. As you said, maybe one of the top causes of prescription drugs of deaths in the country and in the world. Why isn't this being more carefully monitored? Well, doctors are not taught to look at that. They're taught to kind of look in the other direction. So this starts in medical school.
So you found out that antidepressants, they started to add warnings to them about kidney problems, and then that led you to even find out about cancer and antidepressants. Can you talk about that?
Antiperspirants.
Oh, antiperspirants. Oh.
Even worse, really. Think about this.
Everybody uses antiperspirants.
Let me tell you something. My daughter was at the age where she was starting to use antiperspirants, and I didn't know the difference back then between antiperspirant and deodorant. But there was new warnings for kidney issues on there. And when I called and got a source at FDA that's kind of talked to me on background about what was behind the kidney warnings, he said, "Oh, I thought you were going to call me about the breast cancer stuff." And I'm like, "What's the breast cancer stuff?" It turns out, according to this very high-placed source at FDA, that there have long been studies and information connecting probably the aluminum in antiperspirants, which keeps you from perspiring, to breast cancer. And yet every time they thought about adding a warning to antiperspirants, meaning the FDA, he told me, this source, the industry fought them so hard that it's just turned into a perennial debate. Every year they would debate whether to add it. The industry would kind of threaten and beat them back down. I'm thinking, oh, by the way, this guy told me, I said, "Well, what do you do?" He says, "Well, I don't let anybody in my family use an antiperspirant. We use deodorants, which have no aluminum in it. It doesn't keep you from perspiring. It only impacts the odor." But I'm thinking, how did you get to make this decision? Because you have this inside information. You guys aren't telling the public. There's breast cancer in my family. Maybe people I know still want to use antiperspirants, but shouldn't they have the information that says, hey, there may be a link, and if you want to be really, really careful, you might want to consider this. We're not even given that benefit of that knowledge. So that was huge.
Wow. So, I mean, I could talk to you for hours about this stuff because it's just, it's unbelievable. Can you tell the story about you and Robert De Niro? Because I've showed on this show before that Robert De Niro, we had a film festival at the Tribeca Film Festival. There was that movie Vaxxed, and he talked about how his own child, there was a chance that his child had been vaccine injured. And he went on to Today's Show, and he was arguing that there's something there and we should look into it. And then something happened. He got a phone call, or he got threatened, or they pulled that movie from his film festival, and he never talked about it ever again. So tell people about your experience with Robert De Niro.
Well, around this time, Robert De Niro really impressed me with the level and depth of research he was suddenly conducting, because his wife at the time, Grace, was convinced that their son, I believe in his late teens or early 20s at the time, she knew in her mind that he'd gotten autism from vaccines and was asking Robert De Niro to help her investigate and publicize some of this. And I thought, well, if anybody can do this and not be canceled for doing it, it's Robert De Niro. But he started calling me. Someone connected him with me. He was talking to me as a journalist. He was talking to researchers on both sides of this issue, the ones who try to debunk that vaccine autism link and the ones who believe there is one. And he was so methodical and logical about how he researched it. This is a lot to grasp. I mean, it took me years and years to come around to kind of understanding what was going on. He was doing it all in weeks, but it was surrounding, he wanted to have this movie screening at the Tribeca Film Festival, which he co-sponsors. And he was talking to me about just a lot of the stuff, really trying to get the fairest viewpoint of the research and what it showed, and get a grip on how and why the government would not tell the truth about it, what could be done. So I was talking to him during this whole time. And even before that Today Show appearance that you saw, I remember he called me the night before and said, the Today Show is going to have me on. They might ask me about the vaccine thing. And I'm like, they will ask you about the vaccine link. That's why they're having you on. And sure enough, they did. They talked a lot about, actually it was a fair interview, but he was on with his co-sponsor at the Tribeca Film Festival, or the co-founder. And she was, it's my understanding, behind getting the film canceled. And she made a big point to say, we're not canceling the film because of anybody but other filmmakers who objected, which never rang true to me, because other filmmakers who like to make films about and documentaries about untouchable subjects, that they would be ganging up on this one didn't make sense. I looked, and of course, the sponsors of the Tribeca Film Festival are connected to the vaccine industry. And I suspect that that's how they wield their power and control. I suspect they got to her, and then she ultimately really pressed this issue with De Niro and got him to pull that screening of Vax from the festival that year.
And so that's what I'm talking about, how, someone like Robert De Niro, I remember Jim Carrey used to go on Larry King and talk about the connections and the lack of actual safety studies. And RFK now talks about the lack of actual safety studies. There's so much more I want to talk. Let me just ask you this. Liberals seem to have embraced science as a form of religion, and it can't be questioned. And where do you think this need to worship big pharma or science or institutions come from? I mean, where do you think that comes from?
This may, I don't know if I'll be able to express this and do it justice the way I'm thinking. The government and even the military are all wrapped up in the promotion of vaccines, not just for the military, but for the general population, in ways that I don't even fully understand, but that I ran across. I believe there is a psychological operations. It's a warfare operations that our government helps with, where they're using psyops tactics to divide the public, to controversialize the issues, to make the questions untouchable, to get people, they understand through whatever studies they've done of human nature and people, what words they can use, what they can do on social media to get people to, have this kind of blind loyalty and not question, and then pit them against the others and make it a political issue. I think there are puppeteers pulling all of these strings, and that this is the result.
It certainly seems like the people who attacked me for asking normal questions and reporting facts that I found during COVID seemed, now it makes sense that they were under the influence of a psyop, and they didn't know it, because they certainly acted like they were brainwashed, because they were brainwashed and brain dead. And to the point where, I've come from comedy, and comedians are always supposed to be poking holes in the status quo and questioning authority. That's the whole point. The court jester is the one who's allowed to tell the truth to the king. But even comedians, that to me, which was the biggest heartbreak for me, to see my profession completely bend the knee and become under the controls of a psyop, would shame people and even their audiences. They would go on stage and tell their audiences, don't do your own research, which is telling people to don't question authority and stay ignorant and just trust the man on the TV. it's just mind-boggling to me that that's where we've come. People, so you're explaining it as they're really a victim of a psyop.
I believe so, because I believe there are honest thinking people or well-meaning people who believe what they're saying. I think there are bad journalists who report as if they've discovered a firsthand fact, something they clearly haven't studied or read up on. You know, I watch, it's just almost comical to watch reporters debate Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who I think arguably knows more about these issues we've discussed than any top political figure, you know, maybe ever. And to have a journalist who clearly hasn't done their research, who's just buying into the narratives of people who haven't told the truth in the past, to have a journalist tell Kennedy to his face he's wrong about this or that when he's right. You know, I happen to know because I have done 20 years of research, you know, a lot of this stuff. And no one's calling the journalist out. The journalist is just claiming something false is true. And Kennedy is left there to try to say, well, no, that's not true, you know, and it's just a crazy dynamic. As you're disappointed in comedians, I'm very disappointed in supposed journalists who should be asking, like you say, challenging the status quo. That's what we're supposed to do as well as needed, and bring truth to light without worrying about the consequences from, you know, the powerful interests.
So, you know, you all also refer to the CDC as the Center for Data Control instead of what they're supposed to be. So how do they control all the data?
Listen, I had a litany of examples of how they misrepresented all kinds of figures in ways that I believe cannot have been an accident during COVID. Because if you look at the list, every time they misrepresented a figure or made a mistake in the data or something they publicized about how deadly COVID was to children in particular, it turned out to err on the side of making it seem much more dangerous to children than it was. It was never err on the side of, you know, making it seem less dangerous. It was always overinflating. That's what they do when the flu comes every year. This is sort of an MO that I recognize. But there were mistakes in data from the CDC that were of a magnitude that's just incredibly unforgivable. This is an agency that should be careful about its data. I quoted one reporter who had written a medical journal article that got published in some statistical type of journal. She counted a bunch of them. She even contacted CDC to point out persistent errors that remained on the site years after COVID about data and falsely implying things were more dangerous with COVID than were, or maybe the vaccine was better than it was. And they just still didn't want to change stuff. They wanted to stick by the bad information, even when proven wrong, and the bad facts and the bad graphs. They just have all kinds of ways to put out bad science.
So, this book is really, everybody should read this book, and this should be taught in not only journalism classes, it should be taught in medical schools. How did you get Harper Collins to publish this book?
Well, this is interesting. Harper Collins published my other, I think, 3 books. They came to me with this idea.
No.
I was as surprised as you are. And I kind of wondered, would it ever get published? I mean, in the back of my mind, I've seen too many stories be canceled, too many congressional hearings that were definitely going to happen to look at this stuff be canceled at the last minute. But initially, my editor, Harper Collins, asked me to write a book on the COVID missteps, which is a bit of this book goes over that. But I said, by the time this book comes out, which was last September, that will have been pretty well covered by others. I mean, there's some fabulous books, including by Kennedy on, Dr. Fauci and so on. And I said, let's branch this out to the bigger picture, not just what happened during COVID, because people will be stunned. And I will say that the editor who says, Eric, he says he considers himself pretty well informed on these topics. He called me at some point after he read the book and he said, 90% of Americans, even those who know about this, think they know about this stuff, will not know about 80% of what's in this book. Like, he was floored at the anecdotes and the citations and the inside information. And that made me feel really good, because that was the goal, is to try to expose some common things that we're all subjected to in our daily lives. We just have no idea that's happening.
Have you experienced blowback in your own professional or private life from exposing this kind of stuff about modern medicine, big pharma, vaccines?
Not directly lately, definitely back when I was at CBS, and there were certain bosses that wanted me to continue covering these stories, including the dangers of statins, including all kinds of things. But then there was definitely an effort to stop that report. There's this push me, pull you going on inside the corporation, as I think was happening at other media outlets. Yeah, that wasn't pleasant because there were pharmaceutical interests and government officials calling CBS, trying to stop my stories, calling bosses. They would go to parties and talk to my colleagues and tell them my stories had to be stopped or that they were wrong, or, it was just stirring the pot a lot. That's certainly not a pleasant, place to be in. But I'm kind of stubborn. And I always think, when there's that much pushback over something you're reporting, it must really be important. And it makes me kind of more committed to trying to get at the truth. That's how I've treated it. I haven't heard anything about this book. I was very careful, obviously, legally, fact-checking, doing all this stuff over and over and over again with this book. But they kind of leave me alone now. Maybe they do stuff behind my back, but I feel like they don't want to draw attention. It would almost draw more attention to the book to complain about it or try to point things out that they don't like.
So I lost lots of friends. People I've known for 30 years attacked me over COVID. And when I said, hey, schools shouldn't be locked down, this is going to be worse for kids. It's not actually dangerous to kids, just like you said, the virus. And we shouldn't be mandated. People I've known my whole life turned on me and called me a grifter and said I was doing this for clicks and money, and which was the exact opposite. They demonetized most of those videos.
Right. That's
It's
right.
the exact opposite, right? And even when I go to dinner parties, right, when I used to get invited to them, I would, bring up the idea that, when we were kids, we got maybe 6 vaccines. Now that's 72 shots are on the schedule, and their eyes would just bug out. And then I would say, the first one they give them is the hepatitis vaccine, which you can only get hepatitis through drug use, intravenous drug use, or sex. And why are they giving that to a baby? And I've had doctors say to me, like, what? That's the first one they give? I've had doctors say that to me at parties, like they don't get it. And then people just don't want to talk to me anymore. It's like I'm the RFK at the party.
That's happened to me. I get it.
That's happened to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, other journalists don't want to talk about this stuff. I would say it's changed a little since COVID. If you can look at any positive that came from COVID, I don't know if you've noticed this as well. There are a lot of people that weren't paying much attention to all of the things we talked about today, kind of like I was pre-2000, trusting of the medical establishment and your own doctors and thinking there can't be that kind of corruption. And I think a lot of eyes were open and people suddenly realized, well, if the government lied to us about this stuff, the wheels start turning. Well, what else have they lied to us about? And it made activists out of people that never consider themselves activists. They're very concerned when you're talking about their family's health and their health. This suddenly became very important. So I think even for a lot of doctors, you probably talked to Dr. Jay Bhattacharya and people like that. They were very much on with the mainstream narratives and so stunned by what happened and what they learned that they now have started these, I would argue, sort of movements, alternative ideas that really should be the mainstream about getting to the bottom of what's causing us to be so sick, not just treating it and getting at the heart of the corruption. So I think some good has come of it. People have come out of the shadows on this more than they were before COVID.
Well, it's an amazing book. Sharyl Attkisson, Follow the Science. Everybody should get this. It's available where all books are available because it's published by Harper. When I saw that it was published by Harper Collins, my jaw was on the floor. I can't believe it.
Well, good on Harper Collins. We should all be happy that they did that.
I've been censored many times on YouTube for saying some of the things or just asking the questions. Anyway, I really appreciate you, Sharyl Attkisson. Thank you so much for coming on. Everybody should check out that book, and I appreciate, your courage and in the work that you keep doing. It's really fantastic.
Well, you too, and I think people probably who listen to you understand when you step out the way you have, how important that is and how many people you reach. I think that's awesome, and they should know, as you do, that it's not an easy thing to do. So, thank you.
Okay, all right. Well, hopefully we can talk to you again soon.
Okay.
Bye-bye. Come see us on tour. We're going to be in Bakersfield, San Jose, California, Buffalo, New York, Toledo, Montreal, Toronto, Ottawa, Glasgow, Manchester, Belfast, Dublin, Liverpool, Birmingham, and London. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for tickets.